ditch was filled in as screams kept coming from it. He also elaborates, this cruel, despicable, and sadistic treatment against the Jews that has lasted now several years, with its final goal of extermination, is the biggest stain on the honor of Germany. They will never be able to erase these crimes. Noteworthy here is that he was already documenting these atrocities in 1941, before the more mass implementation of the so-called final solution. To help spread the word beyond openly discussing these things with those around, he would also rather bravely do things like gathering dropped Allied leaflets and placing them around his town so the maximum number of people would be exposed to them. His grandson, English professor Robert Scott Kellner, would state of his grandfather's work, Friedrich knew that people like the Nazis would never lose their thirst for power and absolute rule. The last of the Holocaust survivors will soon depart, but his voice will remain, a voice to check revisionist historians and Holocaust deniers with an irrefutable account, an account not by a Nazi or a victim of the Nazis, but by an average German citizen. That said, while he was more or less an average German citizen, he was one who actively sought information about what the Nazis were up to from any source that he could find, piecing together everything from there to try and discern the truth. So what about everyone else? Again, historians are in disagreement as to the extent of the wider public's knowledge about what was going on. This is despite countless surviving journals showing that at least some people were very aware or at least suspected what was going on, not to mention the innumerable number of people directly involved on some level and their relations. Not to mention, again, people seeming to have had at least some level of access to the needed information. So what about the other side of the argument? On the side that it maybe wasn't totally common knowledge, besides many after the fact claiming that they didn't know, we have that it appears many of the Jews rounded up weren't under the impression they would be taken off to death camps or the like. The general perception seems to be that they knew they were going into a really bad situation with the very real possibility of dying, but that they didn't think they were being mass murdered, just extremely mistreated. The Nazi regime helped foster this notion in a variety of ways. For example, in 1941, a booklet printed by the Nazi brass for widespread consumption outlined how Jews in places like Poland had been given work, access to hospitals, food, and those who needed it even provided with vocational training. More directly, they reassured the Jews rounded up and in the ghettos that the deported from these points were being sent to places with better conditions. To help corroborate this upon arrival into the concentration camps, many inmates were forced to write letters about the good condition in the camps. On this note, even in the ghettos themselves, there seems to have been a lot of skepticism about the final solution. The issue primarily seems to just go back to, once again, despite all the evidence slapping everybody in the face, many just refused to believe their fellow human beings could actually be doing this, and it wasn't just some sort of propaganda campaign from the other side. As one of the leaders of the Jewish resistance in Warsaw, Yitzhak Zuckerman, noted, common sense could not understand that it was possible to exterminate tens and hundreds of thousands of Jews. Of course, as Allied troops began liberating countries and their concentration camps as they marched toward Germany, things eventually changed. But before it did, the Allied soldiers almost universally would later write of their exasperation at the apparent widespread accounts from Germans themselves that they had been totally ignorant of any of these atrocities. For example, William Ward of the 232nd Infantry stated, all of the locals were adamant that they were nicht Nazi and didn't have any idea what had taken place at the concentration camp. Another by the name of Arthur Johnson stated, all these people who claimed they didn't know anything about it, and they were just 10 or 15 miles from Weimar, Buchenwald concentration camp. Noteworthy on this one, to counter previous Allied reports about atrocities there, Nazi propaganda had stated all the bodies were from mass burial of air raid victims. In this case, both showing a plausible alternate story, as well as also demonstrating that the news was out there for the German public to the extent that the Nazis felt like they needed to address the topic. In the end, while the matter is still hotly contested, the general consensus is that it is clear a considerable number of people beyond those directly involved did have access to the needed information to know what was going on. But not just largely apparently unwilling to believe it, even when directly told after the war, resistance to the idea seems to have still been a thing throughout the world, at least at first. In short, for a world on both sides used to pretty rampant and often blatantly false propaganda, when it came to World War I and a German populace quite familiar with a whole lot of BS coming from their own government on the propaganda front, it was perhaps difficult to know what to believe, especially when the atrocities were so insane in their reported degree. On top of this, for many Germans peripherally complicit in these acts and under Nazi rule with little else they could do about it, many perhaps simply didn't want to believe that it was true.